The unforgiving summer sun beat down on Willow Creek, a small but growing settlement nestled in the heart of Wyoming Territory. The year was 1878, and like many frontier towns that had sprung up in the wake of the Transcontinental Railroad's completion, Willow Creek existed in that precarious balance between civilization and wilderness. Dust swirled through the unpaved main street as Elizabeth Montgomery stepped down from the stagecoach, her gloved hand shielding her eyes from the blinding light. At 32, Elizabeth carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger, if not unscathed. The locals turned to stare at the newcomer, a striking woman dressed in a tailored traveling suit that, despite the dust of the journey, still spoke of Eastern refinement. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, but it was her eyes that commanded attention, deep blue and filled with a guarded sorrow that spoke of profound loss. I would greatly appreciate if you could subscribe to our channel. We're sharing these Old West tales from all corners of America. Where are you watching from today? Elizabeth had come to Willow Creek to take ownership of her late brother's mercantile store, the only inheritance left after his unexpected passing 3 months prior. Robert's letters had painted Willow Creek as a place of opportunity, a frontier haven where he'd finally found purpose after years of restless wandering. Now those same letters, creased and worn from repeated readings, were all she had left of him. That and a business she knew nothing about in a town that already viewed her with suspicious curiosity. As she collected her trunks and made arrangements for their delivery to the rooms above the mercantile, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice the whispers that followed her progress down the street. She was used to being the subject of gossip. Back in Boston, she had been poor Elizabeth Montgomery, the widow whose husband had gambled away their fortune before a heart attack claimed him at the card table of his gentleman's club. 5 years a widow, and Boston society still defined her by that tragedy. Sheriff Thomas Bailey watched the newcomer from the shade of his office porch, sizing her up with the practiced eye of a lawman who had seen his share of strangers drift through town. "That'll be Robert Montgomery's sister," he said to the broad-shouldered man who stood beside him. "Heard she was arriving today to settle his affairs." James Blackwood merely grunted in response, his attention fixed on the woman who was now disappearing into the mercantile. At 45, James was the most successful rancher in the territory, owner of the massive Cross B Ranch that employed half the men in the county. He was also the most eligible widower, a status that had the town's unmarried women and their matchmaking mothers in a perpetual state of calculation. But James had shown no interest in remarrying in the 7 years since his wife's death in childbirth, focusing instead on raising their daughter and building his ranching empire. Inside the mercantile, Elizabeth was confronted with the physical reality of her brother's life and death. The store was well-stocked and meticulously organized, testament to Robert's business acumen. Mr. Walters, the elderly clerk who had been keeping the store running since her brother's passing, guided her through the inventory and ledgers. "Your brother was well respected, Miss Montgomery," he said, his rheumy eyes kind. "Folk trusted him. He was fair in his dealings and generous when times were hard." Elizabeth nodded, a lump forming in her throat. This was the Robert she remembered from their childhood, dependable, principled, kind, before the war had changed him, sent him westward, seeking something he couldn't name. "He never mentioned being ill," she said quietly, running her fingers along the smooth countertop her brother must have stood behind countless times. The following days settled into a routine as Elizabeth learned the business that was now her lifeline. She had arrived in Willow Creek with little more than her personal belongings. Her late husband's debts had claimed everything else. The mercantile represented not just a connection to her brother, but her only chance at independence. Each morning she rose before dawn, reviewed the ledgers by lamplight, and opened the store precisely at 7. The townspeople came initially out of curiosity to inspect Boston refinement up close, but returned because of her fair prices and efficient service. Elizabeth might have been raised to host tea parties and charity functions, but she had a quick mind for business that surprised even herself. At night, she collapsed exhausted into her brother's old bed, too tired even for the grief that hovered at the edges of her consciousness. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, that James Blackwood first entered the mercantile. The small bell above the door announced his arrival, causing Elizabeth to look up from where she was carefully recording a sale in the ledger. The man who stood in her doorway seemed too large for the space, his broad shoulders nearly spanning the width of the entrance. Despite the heat, he wore a long duster over his work clothes, and the wide brim of his Stetson cast shadows across a face weathered by sun and wind. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged with a polite nod, recognizing him from Sheriff Bailey's introductions on her second day in town. Something in his intense gaze made her straighten her spine, suddenly conscious of the plain work dress she wore and the few strands of hair that had escaped her practical bun. James removed his hat as he approached the counter, revealing thick, dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. "Miss Montgomery," he replied, his voice a deep rumble that matched his imposing presence. "I've come to collect my monthly order." Elizabeth consulted the ledger, finding the standing order from the Crosby Ranch, an extensive list of supplies that constituted the mercantile's largest regular business. As she gathered the items, aware of his eyes following her movements, James added, "And to invite you to Sunday dinner at my ranch." Elizabeth nearly dropped the sack of coffee beans she was holding. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, certain she had misheard. James's expression remained impassive. "My daughter, Sarah, insists on meeting the new owner of the mercantile. She's 11 and curious about everything. Sunday at noon, if you're available." Before Elizabeth could formulate a response, the rancher had placed payment for his goods on the counter, exactly the right amount, and was helping to load the supplies onto his wagon outside. Elizabeth's first instinct was to decline the invitation. She had come to Willow Creek to rebuild her life, not to engage in social calls, especially with a man who stirred uncomfortable awareness in her. But practicality won out. The Crosby Ranch was her biggest customer, and alienating James Blackwood would be bad for business. So when Sunday arrived, she found herself in her best dress, one of the few she'd kept from her Boston life, being driven to the Blackwood Ranch by young Tommy Jenkins, whose father owned the livery stable. The Blackwood property was impressive. Thousands of acres of prime grazing land stretched as far as the eye could see, with the ranch house itself a substantial 2-story structure built of local stone and timber. As the wagon approached, Elizabeth could see a small figure waiting on the porch, a girl with dark braids who must be Sarah. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Sarah Blackwood was a precocious child with her father's dark eyes and a quick intelligence that reminded Elizabeth painfully of her brother. The girl peppered Elizabeth with questions about Boston, about the mercantile, about her journey west. Questions her father might have considered impertinent, but seemed to regard with quiet amusement. Mrs. Hollister, The housekeeper, who had raised Sarah since her mother's death, served a meal that put Elizabeth's own modest cooking to shame. Throughout the meal, Elizabeth found herself repeatedly meeting James's gaze, something in his steady observation, both unsettling and oddly compelling. After dinner, when Sarah had dragged Mrs. Hollister away to show her a new foal in the stables, James invited Elizabeth to join him on the porch. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the valley and bathing the landscape in golden light. "Your brother spoke of you often," James said, after a comfortable silence had settled between them. The statement caught Elizabeth off guard. "You knew Robert?" James nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. "We served together briefly during the war. Reconnected when I found him running the mercantile in Willow Creek. He was proud of you. Worried, but proud." Elizabeth swallowed hard against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Worried?" James turned to face her, his expression softening slightly. "He knew you were struggling after your husband's death. Wanted to bring you west, but wasn't sure you'd leave Boston." A sad smile touched Elizabeth's lips. "He was right to worry. I was adrift. When his letter came asking me to join him in Willow Creek, I was finally ready to accept. I arrived too late." The last words caught in her throat, and she was mortified to feel tears stinging her eyes. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth found herself drawn into the rhythms of Willow Creek in ways she hadn't anticipated. The mercantile thrived under her management, with even the most skeptical townspeople coming to appreciate her fair dealing and willingness to extend credit to those in need, a practice her brother had established that she was determined to continue. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society, using her experience with Boston charity work to help organize assistance for families struggling through a difficult harvest season. And almost without noticing how it happened, Sunday dinners at the Blackwood Ranch became a regular occurrence. Sarah had taken a shine to her, declaring that Elizabeth was to teach her how to be a proper lady, a project that amused both James and Mrs. Hollister. For her part, Elizabeth found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that sometimes troubled her quiet evenings alone above the mercantile. James Blackwood remained something of an enigma, a man of few words but decisive actions. Elizabeth learned more about him from others than from the man himself. Sheriff Bailey spoke of his unwavering sense of justice. Mrs. Hollister praised his devotion as a father. The ranch hands who came to the mercantile respected him as a fair employer who worked alongside them in the worst conditions. Yet in her presence, he revealed little, content to listen to her conversations with Sarah or to discuss practical matters related to the ranch's needs. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster, but he never presumed, never overstepped the boundaries of propriety. Elizabeth told herself that this was for the best. She had learned the hard way that romantic entanglements led to heartbreak. Her marriage to Charles had begun with passionate declarations of devotion and ended with the discovery of his gambling debts and infidelities. She had buried her heart alongside her husband and had no intention of resurrecting it. The autumn cattle drive was a major event in Willow Creek, with ranchers from throughout the territory bringing their herds to the railhead for shipment east. For 2 weeks, the town swelled with cowboys, flush with wages, and eager for entertainment after months on the range. Elizabeth kept the mercantile open late to accommodate the increased business, hiring young Billy Peterson to help with the heavier work and to ensure she wasn't alone in the store during the rowdier evening hours. On the third night of the drive, a group of cowboys from the Bar T Ranch, an outfit known for its rough element, entered the store just before closing. Their leader, a lanky man with a pockmarked face who introduced himself as Hank Doyle, leaned against the counter with a smile that never reached his cold eyes. "What's a fine-looking woman like you doing all alone in a place like this?" he drawled, ignoring Billy's presence entirely. Elizabeth maintained her composure, answering with practiced politeness while signaling Billy to fetch the sheriff. But as the boy edged toward the door, one of Doyle's companions blocked his path. "Now where might you be going, boy?" he asked, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. The atmosphere in the store shifted palpably, tension crackling like static before a storm. "Gentlemen," Elizabeth said firmly, her voice betraying none of the fear that had her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm afraid it's closing time. If there's something specific you need to purchase, I'll be happy to assist you before we lock up for the night." Doyle's smile widened as he reached across the counter to touch her cheek. "Oh, I can think of something I need, all right." Before his fingers could make contact, the door burst open, and James Blackwood filled the frame, his expression thunderous. "I believe the lady asked you to leave," he said quietly, the softness of his tone somehow more menacing than a shout. The confrontation ended without bloodshed, though the promise of violence had hung heavy in the air. James's reputation and the arrival of Sheriff Bailey moments later had been enough to send Doyle and his men skulking back to the saloon. After ensuring Elizabeth was unharmed, the sheriff had followed to make sure the cowboys caused no further trouble. James remained behind, his anger still evident in the tight line of his jaw. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, surveying the store with critical eyes. "Not during the drive." Elizabeth bristled at his tone. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my business, Mr. Blackwood. Tonight was unfortunate, but hardly typical." His dark gaze fixed on her face. "Robert wouldn't have wanted you in danger." The mention of her brother deflated her indignation. "No, I suppose not," she conceded. "But I can't afford to close during the busiest season either." The solution, when James proposed it the following morning, was both practical and presumptuous. For the remainder of the cattle drive, either he or one of his most trusted ranch hands would be present at the Mercantile during the evening hours. "It's not about your capability, Miss Montgomery," he explained when she began to object. "It's about the reality of frontier towns during the drive. Men drink, tempers flare, and trouble follows." Elizabeth recognized the sense in his argument, even as she chafed at the implication that she needed protection. Yet there was something in his concern that warmed her despite herself, a genuine care that she hadn't experienced since Robert's letters had stopped arriving. That evening, James arrived precisely at 6, taking up a position in the corner with a ledger book of his own, reviewing ranch accounts while keeping a watchful eye on the customers who came and went. His presence alone was enough to ensure that the cowboys who entered treated the Mercantile and its proprietress with respect. On the final night of the drive, with the last herds loaded onto eastbound cattle cars, Willow Creek celebrated with an impromptu dance in the newly constructed town hall. Elizabeth had not planned to attend, but Sarah had appeared at the Mercantile that afternoon with Mrs. Hollister, insisting that Elizabeth simply must join them. "Father says he'll even dance one set if you come," the girl had added with a mischievous grin, earning a reproving look from the housekeeper and a startled laugh from Elizabeth. "Does he indeed?" she had replied, finding herself oddly touched by the notion of the taciturn rancher making such a concession. In the end, she had agreed, bringing out the one truly fine dress she had kept from her Boston days, a deep blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes and reminded her that she had once been considered a beauty in more sophisticated circles than Willow Creek could claim. The town hall was transformed by lantern light, the rough-hewn space softened by shadows and the glow of anticipation that filled the air. Couples whirled to the music of a fiddle, piano, and banjo trio, the women's skirts blooming like flowers in the arms of their partners. Elizabeth sat with Mrs. Hollister, watching Sarah's delight as she was led through a simple reel by Sheriff Bailey's teenage son. James found them there, offering a cup of punch with uncharacteristic uncertainty in his manner. "You look beautiful tonight, Elizabeth," he said, the use of her given name sending a small shock through her system. Before she could respond, the music shifted to a waltz, and he extended his hand. "I believe I promised Sarah I would dance if you attended. Would you do me the honor?" Elizabeth placed her gloved hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the floor, acutely aware of the eyes that followed their progress. James proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything. As they moved together through the familiar steps of the waltz, Elizabeth found herself studying James's face. The strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow, the depth of his dark eyes that now held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Why did you really invite me to your home that first Sunday?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. James's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Because Sarah wanted to meet you," he answered, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And because I promised your brother I'd look out for you if you ever came to Willow Creek." Elizabeth missed a step, quickly recovering as James steadied her. "You promised Robert?" He nodded, his expression solemn. "The last time I saw him, about a week before he passed, he'd received your letter saying you'd finally agreed to come west. He was worried about what would happen if he wasn't here when you arrived." The revelation that James had been honoring a promise to her brother sent a complicated mixture of emotions through Elizabeth. Gratitude, certainly, but also a sharp disappointment that his attentions had been motivated by obligation rather than genuine interest. "I see," she said, struggling to keep her voice even. "Well, you've certainly fulfilled your duty admirably, Mr. Blackwood. But please don't feel you need to continue on my account. I've established myself quite well in Willow Creek." James studied her face, seeming to read the hurt behind her polite words. The music was drawing to a close, but instead of releasing her, he guided her toward the doors that opened onto the small porch of the town hall. The night air was cool after the warmth of the crowded dance floor. Stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast Wyoming sky. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, turning to face her, "my promise to Robert may have been why I first invited you the Sunday dinner. It is not why I continue to seek your company." Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as James took a step closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I've watched you these past months," he continued, his deep voice pitched low for her ears alone. "Seen how you've taken a struggling business and made it thrive. How you've won over this town with your intelligence, your compassion, your quiet strength. How you've brought light back into Sarah's life, and mine." His hand rose to touch her cheek, the calloused palm warm against her skin. "I know you've been hurt. I know you came west to escape painful memories, not to create new attachments. But I find myself hoping, Elizabeth, that there might be room in your heart for new beginnings." The tenderness in his expression stole her breath, making it impossible to voice the automatic denial that rose to her lips, the practiced insistence that her heart was safely buried, immune to the dangers of hope. In the silence that followed his declaration, James seemed to read her turmoil. "I'm not asking for promises," he said, his thumb gently tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Only permission." Elizabeth knew he was asking permission to court her properly, to state his intentions openly in a way that would set Willow Creek's gossips ablaze. But in that moment, with the music spilling faintly through the open doors and the vast Wyoming night surrounding them, she found herself wanting something far more immediate. "Yes," she whispered, the single syllable an answer to questions both spoken and unspoken. James's eyes darkened, and he lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat. But Elizabeth remained still, her eyes drifting closed, as his lips found hers in a kiss that began with gentle restraint, but quickly deepened into something that sent heat coursing through her veins. The sensation was like nothing she had experienced before, not the polite, perfunctory kisses Charles had bestowed during their courtship, nor the increasingly indifferent ones of their marriage. James kissed her with a passion that was at once respectful and consuming, his arms drawing her closer until she could feel the solid strength of him against her. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Elizabeth felt as though something frozen within her had suddenly thawed, bringing both pain and exquisite relief in equal measure. She had told herself for so long that her capacity for love had died alongside her disastrous marriage, but the thundering of her heart and the tingling awareness that spread through her body told a different story. James must have seen the wonder in her expression, for his own face softened into a rare, unguarded smile. "I've been wanting to do that since you stepped down from that stagecoach," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Winter came early to Wyoming that year, the first snow falling barely a week after the harvest dance. Elizabeth found herself grateful for the heavy stone walls of the mercantile and the efficient wood stove that kept the living quarters above the store comfortably warm. Business slowed with the weather, giving her time to take proper inventory and to implement some of the improvements she had been planning. James called regularly, sometimes with Sarah in tow, sometimes alone. Their courtship progressed with a deliberate pace that respected both their positions in the community and the ghosts of past relationships that still occasionally haunted them. Elizabeth learned that James's late wife, Catherine, had been the daughter of a neighboring rancher, their marriage as much a business arrangement as a love match. Over time, they had developed a companionable affection, but James spoke of it with a certain wistfulness that told Elizabeth he had always yearned for something deeper. The first major blizzard struck 3 days before Christmas, howling out of the north with a fury that trapped most of Willow Creek's residents in their homes. Elizabeth had just closed the mercantile, planning to spend the evening wrapping the small gifts she had set aside for Sarah, James, and the few other people who had become important to her in her new life. The sudden pounding on the store's front door startled her. Who would be out in such weather? Cautiously, she made her way downstairs, lantern in hand, to find James on her doorstep, snow crusting his coat and hat, his face red from the biting wind. "James!" she exclaimed, quickly ushering him inside and bolting the door against the storm. "What on earth are you doing in town in this weather?" He stomped snow from his boots, removing his hat to reveal hair damp with melted snowflakes. "Had to bring medicine to Doc Parker for Mrs. Wilson's new baby," he explained, his voice rough from the cold. "Thought I'd check on you before heading back to the ranch." The word "back" jolted Elizabeth from her relief at seeing him safe. "Surely you're not planning to ride to the ranch in this storm?" The very idea was madness. Even the short distance to the Blackwood property could prove fatal in a whiteout. James grimaced, acknowledging the foolishness of such a plan. "Mrs. Hollister and Sarah will worry," he said, glancing toward the windows where snow pelted the glass like tiny fists. Elizabeth made a swift decision. "You'll stay here tonight," she said firmly, already moving to stoke the fire in the store's pot-bellied stove. "I'll make up a pallet down here." James caught her hand as she passed, his fingers warm despite the cold he had just escaped. "Thank you," he said simply, and something in his gaze made her heart skip a beat. Here was a man who had faced down rustlers and survived Shiloh, yet he looked at her now with a vulnerability that humbled her. The evening unfolded with unexpected intimacy as they shared a simple meal in Elizabeth's small kitchen above the store. The howling wind outside only emphasized the warmth and safety within, creating a cocoon that seemed to exist outside normal time. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on childhood memories, books they had read, dreams they still harbored. James spoke more that night than Elizabeth had heard in all their previous encounters combined, as though the storm had broken down some final barrier between them. When he described his hopes for the ranch, the improvements he planned, the legacy he wanted to leave for Sarah, Elizabeth found herself included in the vision he painted, not as an afterthought, but as an essential part of the future he imagined. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. To matter so much to someone again was to be vulnerable to devastating loss. As the hour grew late, Elizabeth rose to prepare James's sleeping place downstairs, only to find herself gently pulled into his arms. "I love you, Elizabeth Montgomery," he said, the declaration simple and direct, like everything about him. "I know it hasn't been long, and I know you have reasons to be cautious. But I'm not a man who believes in waiting to speak truth when it's found." Elizabeth stood frozen in his embrace, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling in the face of his honesty. The past 5 years had been about survival, about rebuilding a life from the ashes of betrayal, about protecting herself from further harm. She had come west seeking independence, not attachment. Yet here was this man, strong, honorable, steadfast, offering her something she had convinced herself she would never find again. "I'm afraid," she admitted, the words barely audible above the storm's fury. James's arms tightened around her. "Of what?" he asked, his breath warm against her hair. Elizabeth closed her eyes, forcing herself to articulate the fear that had become her constant companion. Of believing in love again, only to discover it's an illusion. Of trusting and being betrayed. Of building a life with someone only to have it shattered. She pulled back slightly to look into his face, needing him to understand. "My husband made me believe I was cherished, James, right until the day I discovered he had gambled away everything we owned and kept a mistress in a house paid for with my dowry." James's expression hardened at this, a flash of anger on her behalf crossing his features. "I am not Charles Montgomery," he said, his voice low and intense. "I do not make promises lightly, nor do I break them once made. I cannot guarantee that life won't bring hardship or sorrow. No honest man could. But I can promise that you will never face it alone. Not while there's breath in my body." The fierceness of his pledge brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw with trembling fingers. "I believe you," she whispered, surprising herself with the truth of it. "And I think perhaps I love you too, James Blackwood." The admission seemed to unlock something within her, a flood of emotion she had kept dammed for so long that its release was almost painful in its intensity. James bent his head to capture her lips in a kiss that spoke of promise and passion in equal measure. This time, Elizabeth didn't hesitate to respond, her arms winding around his neck to pull him closer. In that moment, with the storm raging outside and warmth blooming within, Elizabeth finally accepted what her heart had known for weeks, that love wasn't dead after all, but had been waiting patiently for her to find the courage to embrace it once more. Spring came late, but gloriously to Wyoming Territory. The landscape transformed almost overnight, from the stark beauty of winter to an explosion of wildflowers and new growth. The Blackwood Ranch spread before Elizabeth as she sat on the wide porch of the house that was now her home, watching Sarah lead her pony through the corral under the watchful eye of one of the ranch hands. 3 months had passed since that blizzard night when James had declared his love. 2 since their quiet wedding in Willow Creek's small church. The Mercantile still bore her name, though she had hired a manager to handle day-to-day operations while she divided her time between the store and the ranch. The arrangement allowed her to maintain the independence that remained important to her, while building a new life with the family she had unexpectedly found on the Wyoming frontier. James emerged from the barn, his tall figure moving with the easy confidence that had first caught her attention that day in the Mercantile. Seeing her on the porch, he altered his course, coming to join her with a smile that still had the power to quicken her pulse. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench, his arm automatically finding its place around her shoulders. Elizabeth leaned into his embrace, marveling at how natural it felt now, this closeness she had once feared. "I was thinking about second chances," she said honestly, "about how life takes unexpected turns." James pressed a kiss to her temple, understanding in his silence. They had both experienced profound loss, had both believed at one time that certain chapters of their lives were closed forever. Yet here they were, writing a new story together on this wild, beautiful frontier. Proof that even hearts once thought dead could be rekindled by the right touch, the right word, the right love. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.